and welcome to our presentation today on our 31st President, Herbert Clark Hoover. My goal today is to educate you on his life and his performance as president, and I will also try to cut through some of the mythological stories that have developed around Hoover, and we'll try to give a more balanced view than many accounts give of his life and times. Again, notoriously the president during the Great Depression, but that's not all Hoover was about, and so we hope to educate you further on his life and the people that he surrounded himself with. So here we see an image of the last of the hands-off presidents. That's just a little subtitle to give you an idea of his governmental philosophy. It's a philosophy that's long gone into the dustbins of history. We've had nothing but hands-on presidents for the most part since the man who followed Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt. And so we'll look into the transition in what the presidency means and what the president's role is during national crisis as well. So we begin our story of our 31st president in the state of Iowa, where Mr. Hoover was born in 1874. He was the middle child. He had an older brother named Theodore, who we'll see a picture of shortly, and he had a younger sister named Mary, also known as May. This is the homestead that Herbert and May were born on. I'm not exactly sure if the older brother was also born here. His parents, Jesse and Huldah, were local Quakers. His mother in particular was a devout Quaker, and his father was a blacksmith who sadly passed away when Herbert was 6 years old. Before passing away, though, he did leave one memory with his son. He lovingly referred to Herbert as his little stick in the mud. And we see the homestead preserved today, and this is one of two national historic sites dedicated to Herbert Hoover. We'll visit the other one shortly out here in Oregon. So upon the death of his dad in 1880, his life changed dramatically. His mother struggled to raise young Bertie, who we see here in a picture from age, I believe he's 3.5 years old there. So his mother did have relatives in the area. Her parents were nearby and helped to care for the kids. But shortly after her death, which happened a couple years after his dad's death, the kids were dispersed amongst relatives, with Bert and his younger sister May being sent to Oregon, and his older sister Theodore, also known as Tad, sent to the other set of grandparents remaining in Iowa. However, the three of them do reconverge later in college at Stanford University. So we move along, and I believe this next picture is of the three siblings who we've talked about. This is 1881, so well, this is actually a little bit of an older picture, I believe, but you see the older brother Tad on the left, and you see young Herbert on the right, and the sister sitting before them. Not exactly sure on the date, but it might be a little past the date of 1881, but shortly thereafter, this is, I think, when the mom was still alive. Shortly thereafter, after her death, May and Herbert are sent to Oregon. And we will see our next slide show that site, and it is in the town of Newberg, Oregon. You see a map of Oregon there, and Newberg would be approximately 20 to 30 miles southwest of Portland. So at the time, Newberg was a small settlement, also a Quaker-friendly town with a Quaker settlement already existing. So I think that was the attraction for the family. This is Huldah's brother, who had moved here earlier, John Minthorn, and Mr. Minthorn started a academy called the Friends Academy for young Quakers living in the area. And this is where Herbert began his schooling at the Friends Academy, an institution today known as George Fox University in Newburgh. His time spent in Newburgh, approximately from the age of about 8 or 9 to about the age of 15, was not a very happy time for Herbert. His uncle John, who I believe we'll meet in the next slide, and that's his aunt Laura Minthorn. John, in particular, was a very difficult taskmaster, had Herbert continuously busy doing farm chores and other work, which Herbert didn't mind so much. But what he didn't receive in this environment was a lot of love. This was a tough household. He was he felt like he was a burden, being an orphaned child, and bonded with his sister during this time, but also was looking forward to getting out on his own, even in his middle teens. And he thought the way out was going to be through education. He was not a very good student at the Friends Academy, except in the subject of mathematics, but he willed himself to prepare for an entrance exam to a newly founded university in Palo Alto, California, a university founded by the next man we meet right here, Leland Stanford. He of railroad fame. He built the railroad across the country along with a few other men, was largely responsible for the growth of the railroad industry in the West in the 1870s and 80s. And by this time, approximately 1890, we're talking about Stanford, who had just lost his son, wanted to dedicate a university to the memory of his son, and thus the concept of Stanford University was created. This was an endowment from the Stanford estate, with the land purchased in Palo Alto on a former farm, and that's why it to this day is known as the farm. This is the Stanford campus as we see it today. Many of the original buildings are no longer extant, but at the time, it was a very small campus with a very small faculty and an equally small student body. But notable, and this is interesting in doing the research for this project, many accounts of Hoover's college life mention his working his way to pay tuition. But it always struck me as odd, because I had always understood that Stanford was founded as a free college with no tuition. And that is, in fact, the case. Stanford did not charge tuition until the 1920s. So, indeed, Hoover had no tuition to pay. He had no college debt to worry about upon his graduation from Stanford, but he did work his way through college as far as paying for room and board and general expenses. He was a continual workhorse in that respect. Not much for frivolous entertainment, but he did find the time to run for class treasurer at Stanford. I believe this is when he was a junior, which meant that position that he won, the class treasurer election of whatever year that was the last election until the 1928 presidential election that Hoover entered. So unlike Coolidge, who we learned last time had a 17-1 record in his attempts to gain elective office, Hoover was 2-1. His two victories being the treasurer position at Stanford and the presidency of the United States. Of course, losing his second attempt in 1932. So we also learn during his studies here at Stanford that he is a natural mathematician. He finds it comes quite easily to him, and he pursues those studies, leaning towards engineering focus. And during this time, he meets the faculty member who is going to be guiding him in his career. But first, we meet the man who inspired the faculty member, and that's the next photo we'll see. And this is Waldemar Lindgren, Swedish-American geologist and considered the founder of economic geology. And very specifically, this category involves the extraction of rock and mineral from the earth and how to turn it into a profitable resource. This was beyond just looking at the composition of rocks. This was looking for rocks that were valuable, how to find gold veins in certain kinds of ore. This man studied in almost every Western state for 30 years, working for the U.S. Geological Survey. So he truly was a widely renowned expert, wrote thousands of articles on this subject, and inspired, I'm not sure if it was a direct student, but inspired a movement that led to the career of the next man we'll meet, John Branner, professor of geology at Stanford during the Hoover years there. And this man was an absolute inspiration to Herbert Hoover. He was the man who helped Herbert apply the practical knowledge to the field, going or sponsoring internships, summer field trips, getting hands-on experience with his classmates. And again, this was a fledgling group at Stanford, both the faculty and the student body. So there was a lot of intimate connections between faculty and staff and students, and lots of personal attention. And to the degree with Hoover that the geology class at Stanford was small enough that the professor was able to facilitate many of the students getting to know each other better, including this student who we'll meet next, the woman who became the love of Herbert Hoover's life. This is Lou Henry, daughter of California banker, daughter of a California banker, so a well-off childhood. And here you see her with rifle on a burro on an outdoor adventure trip, which was very much her style, both before Stanford and after. She enrolled at Stanford, was one of the few female students, was definitely the only geology student as a female, and met Herbert in a John Branner class. And Branner is considered the introducer of the two, and they always looked up to him after this meeting, even to the point of advocating Branner to become the president of Stanford later in life, sometime in the mid-teens, when they were very successfully onto their career. So this is our first meeting with Lou. We'll see a few more photos of her, and an amazing person in her own right, ended up learning 8 languages, including Mandarin, Chinese, which she and Herbert used as a special code in the White House when they didn't want people to hear their conversations. Was an advocate for the Girl Scouts, became a spokesman. We'll see a Time cover piece on her in a little bit. So again, very active, very forceful person, and a more vivacious socialite than her husband would be. So again, a good balance, kind of like we saw with the Coolidges, where the wife ended up being kind of the spokesperson and the husband was the reserved person in the background. The Hoovers followed that same trend. So we'll go to our next shot and we'll see a picture from the very early mining career of Herbert Hoover. Here he is. I believe that's him on the camel, 1898. He was working for a mining company based out of England, and they had sent him to various locations. His first major stop was down under in Australia. His later assignment was in China. And again, during this period, he's working as a mining kind of a front man. He's going ahead to sites to inspect for potential mining operations. He's doing testing. He's mostly working alone, and his wife is with him for most of his journeys on these adventures. So again, a young couple on the move, leading a very exciting life, and they end up in China. And we'll see the next slide. They end up in China in 1900, getting caught up in what became known as the Boxer Rebellion, an internal type of civil war within China. The foreigners who were working there became trapped in the embassy, and the embassy became a target of a siege. So you have the Hoovers, one of about 1,500 Americans stuck in the middle of this, trying to uh, do their part. You had Lou Henry helping to treat illnesses and victims of the violence, and you had Herbert trying to fight back with guns and such, and protect his defense of their little. Basically, it was an embassy courtyard that they were trapped in for, I believe, a few weeks. So this is kind of his first taste of unrest in a foreign land. But again, an absolute inveterate traveler. Both Lou and Herbert loved to travel. They did not find anything about it off-putting or upsetting. They were used to rugged conditions. And again, this is at the beginning of what became a very, very successful career for Herbert in the mining industry. He became a successful consultant, had his own business by 1908, and was a certified multimillionaire by the mid-19 teens. Again, the true success story, from orphan to multimillionaire before the age of 40. This is the early day story of Herbert Hoover. So we'll go to the next slide now, and we'll see, as a successful businessman, as someone who is respected as a Republican progressive, but not so diehard that he couldn't be of bipartisan help. By 1914, with war breaking out in Europe, Hoover is asked to use his organizational skills, which are very, very credible, to help begin the first in a series of relief operations of various kinds. The first relief operation in 1914, Herbert Hoover helped organize evacuation of 120 Americans who were trapped in Europe at the beginning of the First World War. And this was simply a mobilization effort. It involved a lot of coordinating, and it involved a lot of wealthy people donating ships and uses of ships and supplies for this operation. But it was considered successful, and he rode that success into his next endeavor, where he ran the Committee for Relief in Belgium. And this was relief in the form of food, clothing, and supplies, again, at the very beginning of the First World War. He again, this is a private operation for the most part. There are some government monies utilized, but the bulk of it by far is the bulk of monies by far are raised by private sources, from private sources, and it is outside of the realm of government control, which started to drive some U.S. officials a bit crazy, because this was a huge operation that had no oversight. And the one requirement Hoover asked, or actually two requests Hoover had before taking on this role, was no salary and no one to answer to. He was in charge, and he would not take a salary, which again gives him a level of freedom that some people find difficult in this situation. But again, his success is unparalleled as far as getting people fed, getting the supplies to where they need, getting people in a position who weren't corrupt, who weren't skimming, who weren't taking off the top, who saw the needs where they were. And this, again, parlays into another position in 1917, helping the Wilson administration. This is a known Republican tapped by Wilson to lead the U.S. Food Administration, which is basically set up to help economize and to help scrimp and save, so we can share more with Europe and more supplies will be going to the needy folks in Europe. This led to a phrase that became very popular in America, far different than the use of the Hoover name a decade and a half later. This is when the word Hooverizing became known in the common lexicon. And Hooverizing was simply a synonym for economizing. If you were Hooverizing, you were not eating meat one day a week, you were cutting corners, you were saving your bacon fat, all these things that would lead to more surplus to share with our allies, and our soldiers in the very near future were involved. And it was all about saving for the world effort. And again, considered very successful. Hoover moved on to the next job in 1918, leading the European Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. This was an event that saw 34 million tons of food, clothing, and supplies go to 20 different nations, all under the supervision of the great humanitarian. That's the name that started to pop up. We see this slide here when he is running the U.S. Food Administration. And again, there's stories of him declining to be photographed doing his job at this time, because he believed that using particularly starving children in publicity photos that make him look good really wasn't serving the purpose. So he downplayed and often would not allow photographs to be taken in overt way. And interestingly, this leads to later accusations of him being cold-hearted, that he didn't really care, that he was just a cold bureaucrat. And evidence is showing that being far from the truth. The fact is, he was moved heavily by all of these moments where he was directly touching people's lives and feeding them. In fact, one thing came up, I believe it was during this position we see here as U.S. Food Administrator, when criticism started coming up for food relief going to Russia. And he said, "I don't care what politics you are. If you're hungry, you will be fed." And that's a paraphrase, but it was a strong statement to the humanitarian nature of this person. And we continue on to the next slide. We will see the Secretary of Commerce. This is after Harding's election in 1920. He picks Herbert Hoover to be a Secretary of Commerce. This position continues for Hoover after Harding's death into the Coolidge years. And I think Harding and Coolidge had a similar view of Herbert Hoover. He was known as the Wonder Boy. And this was partly, I think, in respect and partly kind of derisively pointed at him, because he was extremely involved in his position as Secretary of Commerce, and it was kind of an undefined cabinet position until he showed up. Of course, we have a growing industrial base in this country. We have new industries popping up in the 1920s, like radio and aviation. And as Secretary of Commerce, Hoover gets fully involved in suggesting and eventually implementing regulations for the radio industry, for the aviation industry. And this is one of the first times you'll see federal intervention regarding law and regulation on private industry. So again, this is considered progressive at the time. This is considered like a new way of doing business for the presidential cabinet members and for the purposes of their offices. And he was kind of what in our family might be known as a Budinsky. He was known as, one person called him the Secretary of the Commerce and the Undersecretary of all other departments, because he just couldn't not share his opinion with all the other cabinet members. He was kind of a pain in the neck in that way. But again, a very serious worker, a very hard worker, and even to the point of being, loyal to these two presidents, Harding and Coolidge, who he did not really have a lot in common with. In fact, there's a story of Hoover playing endless games of bridge with President Harding in the week or so before his passing. Hoover was part of the big trip west with the Harding Party in August of 1923. And Hoover's quote is, "If I have," or something along the lines of, "I will never, ever play bridge again after that endless bridge game on that trip." He was doing it just because he was being a good, loyal cabinet member, undersecretary. He was not a big fan of kibitzing and that kind of socializing. So he did his part and ended up continuing as the Secretary of Commerce through the Coolidge administration. And sometime, I believe the next slide will show the Mississippi flood, or is this going to be? I think we have Lou Henry coming up next. This was during the commerce years for Herbert. His wife gained attention as the leader of the Girl Scouts. She took on this position many thought was ceremonial and turned it into a platform to promote exercise and well-being and socializing for younger girls. And she took a very, very prominent role as the Commerce Secretary's wife and ran with it. And this isn't the only cover she made of Time magazine, too. She was a formidable figure in her own right. So both Lou and Herbert bring a lot to the table, to the point where you can almost describe them as a power couple of the 1920s. Very young and in vogue, and very embracing of modern technological advances, both Lou and Herbert. So our next slide will show the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. This is probably the pinnacle, if you want to put it that way, of Hoover's time at the Commerce Department. This was a national emergency that predated the existence of FEMA, so it was not considered automatic by any means that the federal government would step in and help, even despite this really massive tragedy that affected several states and affected all sorts of industry. So Hoover takes the lead for Coolidge and becomes the front man, becomes the spokesperson basically for the government being there to help. And he isn't really a publicity hound per se. He's not looking for his picture to be in the paper. It's just natural that as a government response team, that the media wanted to make sure his presence was highlighted, and he allowed he was trying not to allow things to get exploitated, but he wanted to just have a reassuring presence that there was relief and there was help on the way. And the Mississippi flood is probably the first example of a massive direct federal intervention in a national tragedy. And this is the time when Calvin Coolidge, as president, decides he's not going to run for another term. And Hoover's name naturally floats to the top of that list on prospective candidates for the 1928 Republican race. And remember, the Republicans are running in 1928 during a very positive time in our country's history. We have no wars to deal with. The economy seemed to be going strongly and going well. And again, it's prosperity that's the key part of the Republicans' attempts to hang on to the White House. It's an easy thing to run when the economy's going well and there's no complaints. We see the next slide looks like it's going to be the 1928 campaign buttons and paraphernalia. Again, Hoover's a pretty easy choice for the Republicans. A bit of a more difficult choice was who to put on the ticket with Mr. Hoover. I don't think it was really a much debated convention. As we've seen from time to time, I think Hoover was kind of an acclaimed choice. So the real maneuvering becomes who's going to be the vice presidential person on this ticket. And again, Hoover is not a dynamic candidate, but he's well known and he's well liked, and he's not the kind of person that the Republican handlers really had to worry about, saying something dumb or putting his foot in his mouth. He was pretty safe and palatable, had a good positive public image at this time. So the vice presidential discussion comes up with, I'm not sure who's next on our lineup here, but who are we going to see next here? Oh, okay, we have a little diversion here. This is possibly out of sequence a little bit, but I wanted to throw this in. This is looking at Hoover and how old he looks in this picture. I believe this is from probably a little bit later. It could be closer to the 1932 re-election attempt. But this story is simply bad publicity that kind of backfired. This is a White House moment where Hoover is having pictures taken with him and his dog, King Tut. And King Tut is eating steak out of the president's hand at a time when not many people could afford to eat steak. And this was seen as being very out of touch, very, very missing the point of what people were going through, and is said to have cost him many, many votes in the 1932 election. So I do believe this is a little bit out of sequence, but it does show you, though, that if this picture was part of the 1928 campaign, it probably wouldn't have gotten much attention because of the way things were. But by 32, this was considered unacceptable, and it hurt Hoover, as we'll see in 32. So we go back to the VP, and this is the man they chose, longtime Kansas Senator and House of Representative member Charles Curtis. Curtis served the state of Kansas for 36 years all total between his House and his Senate years. But the most important thing I'd like to say about Charles Curtis was regarding his ethnic heritage. Charles Curtis was the only mixed-race vice president until Kamala Harris was inducted a couple of years ago. He was not quite a half-blood, but he was about, I think, a third or more Kaw Indian. His mother's side was from the Kaw Indian tribe. He grew up on a reservation in in Kansas. He is the last president to be born in a territory. He was born a couple of years before Kansas became a state. And interestingly, as an 8-year-old, he was on the reservation when another tribe came and raided the Kaw tribe. He escaped with someone else on horseback to deliver the message of the attack to neighboring folks. So he was, even as a kid, involved in some of the last of the native uprisings as a native, and ended up in his later years and in his early adulthood being an expert horseman. Loved to race horses, and was very, very proud of his Native American heritage all through his congressional career. He never shied away from it. He wore traditional garb from time to time. His office was decorated with all sorts of Native American artifacts. And interestingly, as far as politics goes, he was considered a conciliator. He was a middle grounder as a Republican in the Senate between disparate factions of his own party and between Republicans and Democrats. He was the minority whip, and he was also the majority leader in the Senate. So similar to Lyndon Johnson's role in the 50s, in that he was a go-to negotiator who can appease both sides of a party. So he was considered someone who would get things done, and different enough from Hoover to bring in a different line of votes. In many respects, he was more conservative than Hoover, not considered a progressive, and was a very, I guess you'd say, traditional party man in that respect. As a politician, he advocated for assimilation of Native Americans while at the same time increasing funding to them. So he would prefer, during his career, he was always advocating an end to the reservation system and just a re-entry into society on an equal level, regarding land ownership, regarding opportunities, education, etc. So it kind of an interesting mix of politician and someone who's proud of his heritage. Also, he's the first U.S. official to open an Olympic ceremony, and this was in 1932 in Los Angeles. So there we have the VP candidate, and now we're going to meet the opponent. And this is a guy some of you may have heard about, New York Governor Al Smith, the happy warrior, waving a happy hello to his fans out there. Al was a 4-term governor of New York, which I did not realize that he held the seat for that long. There was a break in his serving, so it wasn't contiguous. But he was a Brooklyn-born, Brooklyn-based guy. He's known for his Irish heritage, and at the same time, his father was an Italian-American whose last name was Ferraro, and he also had German heritage as well. So he was really a multi-ethnic New York melting pot kind of guy, and was an extremely effective politician. You might compare him to a later New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia as far as his anti-corruption. He was a city politician who strangely was not tainted with Tammany Hall connections. Again, he was one of those people who, had to use corrupt parts of machines to get things done, and yet had no taint on him personally. You can see that trend in politicians of this time. I would say Coolidge is an example too. Even Hoover, they're clean personally, but they have to kind of involve themselves in some dirty dealings to get things done. His record in New York is excellent, and again, like Hoover, was known for bipartisan support. One of his closest allies in New York City and Albany regarding reform, and that's what he was mostly known for as governor, was labor reform, meaning safer workplaces, lessening the hours per day worked, and these kind of things. One of his colleagues was Francis Perkins, who went on to great fame with Franklin Delano Roosevelt as his labor secretary. So again, his friends and allies went across the board. They chose as a running mate, they chose a man from Arkansas named Joseph Robinson, who was considered an opposite Democrat in that he was a Protestant and a prohibitionist. Smith was on record as a anti-prohibitionist, and of course everyone knew he was Roman Catholic, and that really became the story of the election. Yeah, there were some concerns about his being too friendly with the alcohol producers, and was like a little too pro-alcohol for a lot of folks who were still reluctant. But it was his religion that became the main problem, one might say. And I'll just find a quote here from a newspaper that was attacking him. It was the quote was, "A vote for Al Smith is a vote against God." So they were really trying to let the people know that a Roman Catholic in the White House was going to lead to papal decision making for our country, that there was a direct line there. This is the same story we heard in 1960 when John Kennedy ran for president. Somehow the Pope was behind all of the maneuverings and was trying to place an agent in the White House. Al Smith was no agent of the Pope, that's for sure. But one thing that's interesting to look at is how would the country have looked different had Al Smith gotten in to the White House? And it's hard to say, but one thing we can say about the 1928 election, and we'll see that Al Smith lost in pretty much a landslide, but one thing did shift in 1928, and it's the election when the Democrats started, in the city Democrats, especially African Americans, started voting more consistently as a Democratic bloc. And this is the shift away from the Republican post-Civil War era when the Republican Party secured most African American votes. This is the beginning of the shift that goes way hard towards Roosevelt the next election cycle in 32. But it does begin right here. And you see the evidence in endorsements of Al Smith by the NAACP, by Black newspapers all across the country. They are looking at, like, if Smith gets in, this is truly a game changer. Again, this is a northern urban Democrat. This is not the kind of Democrat that's going to appeal to the South at all. In fact, when we'll see in the election, Hoover he picks up states that have been lost in the South because of this shift. The Northern Democrat is scary to many Democrats in the South, and we see Hoover pick up 5 states that had been lost to Republicans in previous election cycles. So we do see a beginning of a shift in the way people vote in this country. Now we will meet the I believe we're going to meet the new president, Herbert Hoover, giving his inauguration speech. And he was inaugurated by former President William Taft. And there's a little story about Taft kind of having some fumbly mumblies there during the inauguration. And there's a story that it's just one of a few times where, they had to kind of redo it to make sure they got it right. But Taft was getting near the end. He was getting a little fumbly anyway, but they got through it. And Hoover has his successful transition into the White House, replacing his former boss, Calvin Coolidge. And this is how his administration begins in March of 1929. He's also the last president to take office on March 4th. They changed the rules, and by the time Roosevelt takes over on March 4th. The following election in 36, we go to a January inauguration. So we move along to the swearing in, and this is the moment I had just discussed. I wasn't sure we had this picture, but there was some sort of gaffe in the reading of the oath of office there. So they got that straightened out, and Hoover was officially in. And here's one of his first choices for Secretary of State. And this is a remarkable man in U.S. history that doesn't get a lot of play. His name is Henry Stimson, born in New York City, the son of a famous surgeon. His dad, Lewis, was the first surgeon to use antiseptic in a public operation to prove the effectiveness of what basically became known as Listerine, the antibacterial formula invented by Mr. Lister in England. So his family is well off because of his father's successful career. He's sent off to Yale, where he gets inducted into the Skull and Bones, and then he becomes a graduate of the Harvard Law School. So he covers both Yale and Harvard. Becomes a U.S. attorney appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, Secretary of War under William Howard Taft, World War I artillery officer, Governor General of the Philippines in the 1920s, Secretary of State under Hoover, and then after this, he becomes Secretary of War in 1940 for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt replaced his Secretary of War from the late 1930s with Stimson. As war was getting closer, FDR felt he needed a strong hand in the Secretary of War position, and he certainly got one with Henry Stimson. Henry Stimson also headed the Manhattan Project. So if you see the movie Oppenheimer, he's in there. I don't know who plays him, but he's the boss of the Manhattan Project. And he's one of a handful of people who know all the details about it before anyone else. And what we also get out of the Stimson period as Secretary of State is we get something called the Stimson Doctrine, which is a very high-sounding, very morally sound doctrine that says the U.S. will not recognize international territorial changes executed by force, which I think it was a direct response to Japan's invading Manchuria. They were not going to recognize the newly annexed territory because it wasn't taken with proper channels, implemented. So this was his statement against world aggression. And again, briefly on his later career as heading the Manhattan Project, he not alone, he, like Albert Einstein, thought that the nuclear bomb would be the end of all wars because that would be the end of all of us. And this weapon finally has, in his belief, has led us to a peaceful period in U.S. and world relations. And he wasn't quite right about that, but it was interesting to read all of his observations. We move forward to a little bit of outdoor time. This is, again, the summer of 29 when things were still kind of floating along. You see the pup along with the with the first couple in a moment of relaxation. And again, things were not going to stay relaxed for too much longer. Hoover's earliest attempts in the White House to address issues. One of his earliest attempts, even before the stock market crash, was to set up a farm labor board, which was going to be buying surplus farm materials to stabilize prices, which he did pass. He did get passed in 1929. And also setting up kind of the social structures of what the Hoover White House was going to look like. There are several interesting stories floating around about how the Hoovers interacted with their White House staff. I mentioned earlier that they often spoke in Manchurian to throw off eavesdroppers, to keep their conversations private. They also had a signal system. So, and this is because Herbert Hoover did not want to interact with staff. He wanted them to disappear when he entered the room. So when the signal went off, there was a 3-bell system. When the 3 bells went off, it meant the president was coming, go hide. And so they would hide in a closet or behind a bush or wherever. If they were outside, same system. He did not want to interact with the people that worked there. And so they had the system in place. And they also had a hand signal system for the staff. So this was in lieu of words. For example, Lou Henry would touch her hair, and that indicated dinner will be served now. And like a third base coach in baseball, like steal second. So they had their own little system going, and some found it strange, some found it aloof, some found it like they were being like too haughty for regular people. It's hard to say why they decided to implement these things, but one of the things that they didn't implement on their own, but it was a tradition that they were going to carry on, was the tradition of the First Lady hosting White House tea parties for the wives or spouses, mostly wives then, of congressional members. And so this leads to the controversy of the summer of 29. And we'll see in our next slide a very beautiful photograph of, I believe this should be Jessie DePriest. We see Jessie DePriest in the lower right-hand corner of this picture. She's also featured in the photograph, I believe. And above Jessie in the lower right-hand corner is her husband, Oscar. Oscar Stanton DePriest was the first African-American elected to the House of Representatives in a 30-year period. This was about a little after 1900 he was elected, I believe. And he was the first since Reconstruction. So for the first Northerner African-American and the first in about 30 years since the end of Reconstruction. So again, this upsets the social norms in DC and around the country when Lou Henry extends the invitation to Jessie, wife of Oscar, as she extended the same invitation to all of the other newly entering wives of the newly elected representatives. So this event, and Lou Henry was aware of the potential controversy because she was sure to only invite other members, other wives who were friendly towards African Americans. It wasn't a random list. She couldn't invite them all at one setting. So I think there were 5 events and 5 tea parties, and she picked a group with Jessie DePriest that would be compatible. So it went off without a hitch, except that the Southern press caught a hold of this, and it became a really, really big deal. The reason it became a big deal is because the South thought that they had a racist in the White House. The South thought that, well, Hoover's, way more like us than Al Smith. So, 5 states that hadn't voted Republican for quite some time, since the beginning of Jim Crow suppressing Republican votes, 5 states, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia, all voted for Hoover. And again, it was a landslide. Smith, he picked up a few states, but Hoover had 450 electoral votes, and it wasn't a question. But picking up these southern states was significant. And what was behind this controversy over inviting a Black woman to the White House for tea was something called the Tinkham proposal. It was a proposal in the House by a representative from Massachusetts that was going to reduce Southern representation in the House proportionate to the amount of Black voter suppression that was taking place in their state. This is basically embedded in the 14th Amendment, that if the 14th Amendment allows for this provision, and Tinkin was simply trying to bring attention to it, that if you're going to block actual eligible voters just because of their skin color, we're going to take those people out of the population numbers and reduce your seats in the House, which should have been done 40 years prior to this. And the fact that it was even brought up was a big deal because it got shut down. There was no chance of this passing at the time. But the fact that it was on the table and it was being discussed made everything kind of tense. And one of the responses from a senator who was offended by this horrible invitation of this Black woman, he called it a great blow to the social stability of the South. Remember, inviting a Black person to a tea event in DC is somehow a great blow to the social stability of the South. So overblown in that respect. But again, the Hoovers stayed cool. They had no response publicly to it. They simply were following protocol, and they felt simply doing the right thing. So this is all kind of light, fluffy stuff compared to what we come up to next, because we know what's happening next. No, go the other way. That's the happy times. No, we're going the other way into the crash, right? This is what made this report a bit difficult to muddle through because of the moments that we're going to be covering here with the Wall Street crash. Wall Street in panic, October 1929. I'm not going to talk about potential causes or the depression itself. Too complicated. But what I am going to talk about is what can a country do? What can a government do? What can a president do at the time we're talking about to respond to this? Hoover is trashed in history for doing nothing, for being aloof, for not understanding people's suffering, on and on and on. None of those statements are actually true because we've already seen his humanitarian side. We've already seen like his heart it exists. Now, again, growing up as a Quaker too, Quakers are all about containment. They're all about not demonstrative showiness. They're all about public good, serving the public. So his whole persona is wrapped up in his Quakerness, and his seemingly like unemotional nature is all tied up in that. It doesn't mean he's not affected by all of these things. And right away, to his credit, Hoover decides to go to work. And what is his response to the depression or the crash? Because it's not a depression yet, it's simply a crash. Again, he does what leaders of the ship are supposed to do in tough times. Calm words. Everything's going to be okay. This is just a blip. Whether he knew or not, obviously he didn't. But again, it's just you want to just kind of get a hold on things. But what was happening during this period in 1929 into 1930 was things continued to deteriorate. Things. It wasn't a blip. It wasn't like a quick flash in the pan. Things were getting worse. Unemployment was going lower. Hoover was calling for voluntary compliance with retention, meaning he wanted big companies to hold on to employees or at least furlough them, not officially lay them off or fire them. Like he was trying to come up with price stabilizing methods. He was trying to come up with ways to stave off massive layoffs and unemployment by giving incentives to the companies to retain people. The voluntary part of this, of course, has limitations. Again, he did the same thing with the banks. He was calling them in voluntarily to self-regulate, et cetera. And again, this is at a time when we have no precedent for the federal government stepping in a crisis of this nature, other than the gold standard and the types of panics that happened in 1907, and we saw one in 1893. The direct intervention by, at the time, Cleveland and Teddy Roosevelt, it was not direct intervention to the people. It was direct intervention to the bankers to get things as straight as possible, as quick as possible from the top. Hoover had this potential to go further than he did. He had Mellon Andrew Mellon was still in charge of the Treasury. Um, and Mellon was very resistant to some of these direct involvement ideas that were starting to get more pressing as the Depression goes on and on. So we see Hoover's response. The Federal Farm Board was one attempt during it was the Agricultural Act of 1929. It's the first attempt by feds to try to stabilize farm prices, because the farmers are the ones who suffered throughout the 20s. They had no enjoyment, no roaring 20s for the farm sector. And so that was the first thing he tried to address. This is even before the crash in 29. In 1930, Hoover does something very, very dumb by most accounts. He signs a high tariff act called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that increases the prices on imports to the point where their imported goods are not selling, and the countries trying to sell aren't selling, so they don't want any of our products. So it basically it's part of a shutdown of our economy. This end of trade between countries. It basically halts thanks to this high tariff. And he also, in 31, that was in 1930, in 31, as the employment rate continues to grow, it starts at about 10, we see in 1930, 10 to 12, then it goes to 15 by 31. It's at 20+% by 1932. So late 31, early 32, he pushes through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is basically a holding center for banks and large corporations to use. It's a money source that they can borrow from to keep their things floating. But it's not, again, this is indirect relief. This is not going to relieve people suffering, because a lot of this money never sees the public. It never trickles down to where it's supposed to be helping. And as a result, through 31 and 32, this is what we see: a deep, deep, deep depression with bread lines. Shanty towns were called Hoovervilles by this time. Empty pockets were Hoover flags. Newspapers were Hoover blankets. So from Hooverizing in the teens to the Hoover connotations of 1931, 32, it's staggering, the drop off in popularity. I mean, he is the scapegoat for everything at this point. And again, in 1932, this was his last attempt to raise revenue and to try to cover some increasingly exposed areas. He helps pass the 1932 Revenue Act, which is actually a staggering tax hike for the rich. It's possibly one of the largest we've ever seen, but it comes at a too little, too late time, and possibly this would have made no difference had he done it the day after the crash happened, because again, he was running on low tax platforms all through the 20s. His whole Commerce Department, they like to downplay the taxation and play up technology. Like, in other words, all they kept doing through the Coolidge years was lowering taxes for the rich. And now Hoover realizes that he's got to put the brakes on somehow. And again, the 1932 Revenue Act is passed, but by June of 32, it's too late. So we continue on with the next slide. This would be let's see. This is the blame game that's going on at this point. It's not hard to do. It's one person, and his lack of charisma plays a big role here. His reservedness plays a big role. He doesn't have the kind of the acting facility to step out and make a difference, and seemingly makes his situation worse as he repeats things like, we're almost out of this now, and poverty is going to be a thing of the past. And he's saying things that are just not based in reality, and it's making the situation seem worse. And it was pretty bad, but it's seeming worse than it is, because he's doing nothing to stabilize how people are feeling. There's nothing tangible at this point to have them look forward to something. So we continue, and we will see possibly the real reason for a lot of the anti-Hoover feelings. It's prohibition. Prohibition had more to do with bad feelings, probably, than people realize. Of course, they're hungry and they're out of a job and there's poverty and there's all sorts of want. But the simple joy of having a beer is also blocked legally at this time. And the failure of prohibition is becoming glaringly obvious. So Hoover, the man of commissions and committees and research and technological advances, decides early in his administration, this is in 29 before the crash, he puts together something called the Wickersham Commission, and it's an 11-member commission, and they're told to study prohibition, its effects on the public and sentiment and actual police activities. It was a comprehensive and thorough look at prohibition from every angle possible. And it took 2 years to come up with a conclusion, a final report. And I'm going to give you this is the summary of the report as given by Franklin P. Adams, a very underrated columnist of the period. He was working at the time for the New York World. And here is Franklin Adams' opinion of the Wickersham report. Prohibition is an awful flop. We like it. It can't stop what it's meant to stop. We like it. It's left a trail of graft and slime. It don't prohibit worth a dime. It filled our land with vice and crime. Nevertheless, we're for it. So this is a mockery of the report by the Wickersham Commission that basically backs up prohibition while telling you all the reasons it wasn't working, and even with tripling the enforcement, it still wouldn't work. But they still like it. And again, Hoover didn't so much support prohibition as he supported the law. I don't think he really cared one way or the other if alcohol was legal or not, but he did believe in the law. And his opposition, may have helped him against Smith in 28 to a degree. But by the time the 1930 rolls around, all of these provisions to alter the prohibition laws or water them down, it really was just simply a failed experiment that was near the end. And I think these people were extremely frustrated as a result. And we're going to see more frustration coming up. This is, again, one of the many shanty towns known as Hooverville, USA. But even more sad, we see events like the Mexican repatriation of 1931. At this point in the Depression, Hoover somehow becomes convinced that the Mexican population in this country is largely responsible for the Depression, which is unfathomable to think. Such a world event can have such humble origins in a small population from a neighboring country. As a result, 1931 saw the highest number of deportations and repatriations to Mexico from the U.S., mostly from Los Angeles and Southern California. The number was somewhere around 150,000 just for that year alone. But remember, some of these people sent back they voluntarily went back. It wasn't like they were put on a train forcefully and told to leave. There were deportations, but the number of repatriations are much higher. And these aren't considered deportations. They're simply escorting people out, sometimes against their will, but not always fully against their will. And then you had a Mexican government at this time with funding to receive these people coming back to Mexico. So it's a confusing period. I never heard anything about this until doing this research, and it was very limited to the West Coast. Not completely, but mostly the large number of people sent to Mexico were West Coasters. And again, the estimate is up to 40% of those people were U.S. citizens, often in the form of kids who were born here, but their parents weren't, so they went back with the parents. So again, a sad side chapter for people who were, just like everyone else, was struggling to get by. But the mentality was, let's clear out these people, and then our people can have jobs that these people were taking. It didn't work that way. Jobs didn't open up because these people were sent to Mexico. There were no jobs to begin with. So we look ahead at another sad event from this period, the Bonus March of 1932. This begins in the Midwest. It's on the heels of a large riot in Michigan at a Ford factory plant. And these are basically veterans from the First World War who are demanding an early payment on what was a promised bonus down the line. They were supposed to get this bonus in 1945, and they just weren't going to make it till 1945. That was 13 long years away. So they simply decided to take their certificates, which entitled them to the bonus. It was a certified government piece of paper, and they marched to the tune of about 20,000. They marched to downtown Washington. They were given permission by Director of Parks in D.C., Ulysses Grant III, gave them permission to camp peacefully, which they did. They had a very orderly camp. They had they had enforcement, they had latrines, they had everything they needed, cook tents. They were given supplies by the DC police and by certain citizens who were sympathetic to them. And they simply came to DC in the summer of 32 ahead of a vote. There was a vote on this particular bill that was going to be going through Congress around that time in June of 32. And so they were there to try to bring publicity to this story. And so when the vote passed the House, this is approving the bonus to move that date up from 45 to 32, they had a celebration. They were halfway home. They only needed the Senate to approve. And then hopefully Hoover would sign it and the bill would become law and they would get their bonuses. But the Senate resoundingly rejected this bill of the bonus bill, which Hoover would have definitely vetoed anyway. And it kind of diffused a lot of the campers and bonus marchers, but not all. And supposedly the ones who lingered in camp were the communists. They were the organizers. They were the ones who didn't care about labor or bonuses. They were simply just rabble rousers, according to the official report. And so about a month after that last vote came down against the bonus march people, there were still several thousand people lingering about. They hadn't gone back to their houses yet, even though some were actually paid to leave. So Hoover decides to send them on home, and he sends a military attaché out to kind of move them along. It ends up turning into a fiasco under the hands of Douglas MacArthur, who took a simple order from Hoover to move people out way past the limits of his authority and ended up charging across a bridge with 5 tanks and hundreds of artillery and cavalry and basically lighting shanty towns on fire and driving people out. 2 people died, hundreds injured, both sides. And it ends up being a fiasco that MacArthur does not get reprimanded for. And also Mr. Eisenhower and Mr. Patton were on hand also. And Eisenhower personally was appalled, but again, followed the chain of command and did nothing. And so the fact that MacArthur, this was a publicity nightmare for Hoover, but the fact that MacArthur was allowed to exceed authority and not be reprimanded made it really look bad for Hoover. This made it seem like Hoover authorized and absolutely backed this action, and his popularity is already way low. Well, it plummets from there, and now we kind of see the handwriting on the wall as far as the next president goes. It's going to be whoever is the Democratic candidate, and as we know now, that became Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And here you have the next phase of the election cycle in 32. You have the standby Hoovers and the we got to do something else. It's unite time for Roosevelt. This was an election that was pretty much predetermined beforehand. Everyone realized Hoover didn't have a chance, and he even got more uncharacteristically desperate towards the end of the campaign cycle. He decided to go out on the campaign trail. He was pelted by tomatoes and eggs and epithets and just all sorts of derogatory behavior. And he kept defending himself. He kept defending his administration and kept saying things like, we're just around the corner. It's, prosperity is almost back. And it just wasn't ringing true. So Hoover and Curtis were doomed to a defeat in this election. And indeed, the results were about the same as Hoover's victory in 28, as far as the margin of victory. Franklin in pretty much a landslide. But we do have one event before the transition of Hoover to FDR, and it's the assassination attempt on FDR in February of 33. So this is after FDR is elected, before he's inaugurated. This is an event in Miami. It's an impromptu speech given in front of 20,000 people. It's only a minute long. It's a very brief speech before he's getting on a train, when a Italian-born anarchist named Zangara decided to attempt to put some bullets in FDR. 4 people were wounded. 1 was shot and killed. That happened to be the mayor of Chicago, who was sitting next to FDR at the time. His name was Anton Cermak. And some theorists have claimed that Cermak was actually the target of the assassination because Zangara had Chicago mob connections and such. But ultimately, the story isn't provable, and it's still considered an assassination attempt on Franklin Roosevelt. Cermak died a couple of weeks later, possibly from medical malpractice. But the story is, Roosevelt was saved by a older woman who happened to grab the gunman's arm and have him shoot high as opposed to where he was aiming. So that's the official story. And we see the transition between Hoover and Roosevelt. And this is a magazine cover that we never got to see in public because it was pulled due to the sensitive nature of this assassination attempt. The next slide shows a cover that was never published in the New Yorker magazine, dated March 4th, 1933. And this is, again, one that was shelved because of the sensitivity over the assassination attempt. And we begin the Roosevelt years, of course, at this time. But one more little side note about the bonus army. They tried to come back again in the early days of the FDR administration, and they did. They made it back to D.C. They were greeted with a little more friendliness. They had a whole site developed for them with a cook tent and latrines already set up, so they didn't have to do anything themselves. They just showed up. They were treated with food, and they had a special guest come one day, and it happened to be Eleanor Roosevelt came for a visit, and she was very sympathetic, of course. So one of the veterans remarked, "Well, Hoover sent the army, and FDR sends his wife. So what do you think the difference is?" And again, a different approach by FDR completely, but same result. FDR vetoes the bonus bill in 1936, but it passes over his veto. So Hoover, Roosevelt, not that different in their feeling towards giving away money. Again, you don't hear much about Roosevelt vetoing charitable bills, but here's an example where he followed Hoover's lead, but there were enough votes to override. So by that time, the people were like, give the veterans what they get. Just give it to them. And we will go ahead with the Hoover years post-presidency. Here's a lovely photo of Adolf and Herbert. Herbert was certainly no fan of Adolf Hitler. There's no question about that. Thought he was a crazy man, and yet was no fan of FDR. So this kind of puts him in a weird position in 1938, as Hoover is obviously on a rampage that's not going to stop. Hoover still thinks we don't have to get involved, and quickly changes his tune right after Pearl Harbor. But again, this is just kind of symbolic of the alienation that Hoover felt at this time. Because remember, the Republicans looked at him at this point kind of as a toxic. They really didn't want him endorsing candidates. They didn't want him going out there trying to run again. He considered running in 36 when Alf Landon got the Republican nomination. And after that, they really pushed him away. So during the 40s, he was kind of on his own. The 1950s saw a revival of the Hoover image and the Hoover spirit, and he started to be brought back into public life as an advisor. We see him talking with Harry Truman, who he became friendly with. And again, he's back in his role thanks to Truman and Eisenhower, he's back in his role as international troubleshooter. Again, helping to coordinate food relief efforts in Poland, most particularly. And he also allowed himself at this time of his life to be more photographed in these situations. He wasn't as sensitive to the image created by what he thought was exploiting kids for other purposes. So he actually became more agreeable to being photographed in these settings and started to restore his image as the great humanitarian. And we see the Hoover Dam, which became the Boulder Dam, in an angry spite to the ex-president. Then it went back to the Hoover Dam thanks to his friend Harry Truman in 1947, where it continues to be named today. I always wondered about that. I always thought there were two different dams, but I didn't realize there was a name change there. And we continue on to the elder Hoover, who became, I wouldn't call him an advisor to the president here, but again, friendly relations. He just became more comfortable in his own skin. And again, I want to show you just a little bit of what I identified as a Herbert Hoover sense of humor. He had one. One of the things he said, well, a couple of things he said. When he was asked about the 1932 election, why did you lose the 1932 election? He said, as nearly as I can learn, we didn't have enough votes on our side. Okay. And then we have another quote. This is on the birth of his granddaughter. I hope she doesn't have to be confirmed by the Senate. It's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And one more Hoover joke on surviving all of the post-presidential ostracism he received. How did you handle it, Herbert? And he answered, I outlived the bastards. He did live to 90 until Jimmy Carter, the oldest surviving ex-president. And I hope this presentation helps to restore a bit of the public image of Herbert Hoover. I think I was a confused kid reading about him and hearing Archie Bunker singing, we can use a man like him again. And then I'm looking at the pictures of shanty towns, and I didn't understand any of it at that point. But I think I understand a little bit more now. He was again, a guy who tried to do his best under what he felt were the constraints of his times. And it's to look back and to see a president to act differently at that period, it's hard to imagine anyone stepping out of the constraints of the presidency, even under such dire circumstances, to do something radical. Hoover was almost more concerned about the structure and the institution than the people affected by it, which is unfortunate, but again, a sign of the times. So I conclude here, and I'm happy to help out, perhaps answer some questions.
Yeah, one question is, you mean to tell me they couldn't find him another 1,250 votes so he could win the presidency the second time around? Okay.
Yeah, he was short about 7 million actually in the popular vote, and he needed about 350 more electoral votes. So it was,
he was way off.
He was way off, and he was just being kind of a silly guy right there. I think he was just trying to make fun of something that wasn't very fun for him.
But my question actually is, did he run for 2 terms, and was he running for the third time around, or?
No, he never ran for a third term. He ran twice. He won the first time in 28. He lost in 32, and he attempted a little bit in 36 to get back in it, but he was rejected by the Republican regulars and never attempted to run for president again.
Okay, but you weren't allowed to run a third term anyway, so why was he?
That is true until after Roosevelt. Well, no, he could have until Roosevelt ran his third and fourth term. Then they changed the rule, so it was still allowed up until I guess 1946 or 7. It was still allowed, but it was considered to break. What Franklin did was breaking tradition. He didn't break any rules, but he broke tradition, which upset a lot of people. Because it was always the standard. If George Washington didn't run for a third term, then no other president should ever run for a third term. It was the Washington standard, but it wasn't a rule.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes.
I would just want to check the chat board because there were some comments coming in, and I actually made one as well. I just mentioned that Charles Curtis would be a great Jeopardy answer, just because people think that Kamala Harris is first. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
It would be a trick question, I think. Some cases people would answer. If you said Indian. Henry Stimson is portrayed by James Remmer. That's according to Jeff, and that's correct, Jeff. And I put in the chat, there's a specific scene in Oppenheimer, for those of you that saw the recent movie, that provokes a divide in opinion, very strong opinions, because Christopher Nolan, the director, he told the actors to do research on their characters. So the guy, James Remmer, who plays Henry Stimson, did research and did indeed find out that he honeymooned in Kyoto with his wife, but he risked that line. We don't know that he said that in that moment when they were deciding where to drop the bomb. He just threw it in, and Christopher Nolan, the director, said, "Yeah, that works. Let's go with it." And a lot of historians are very, up in arms because there were a lot of thrown in lines that were improv by the actors who had done extensive research on their characters. So I thought that was interesting.
It is interesting, and I have further comment on that.
Okay,
because,
go ahead.
Because what I researched, and I had to kind of go deeper into it, but it turns out that Stimson did not honeymoon in Japan because there's a date connected with a visit to Japan. He definitely visited in the 1920s, and he definitely visited the city of Kyoto. There's no question he was in Kyoto. I don't know if it was official business, military, personal. I have no idea. He was already married a long time. It could have been a vacation with his wife. I don't know. But I do know that Kyoto was one of the two cities targeted for the nuclear bomb. I don't know which one got changed, but it was, of course, we know Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But originally it was one of those two and Kyoto. And Stimson said, no, Kyoto. No, not going to happen. Now, this could have been a military decision because Kyoto didn't have the military personnel. It didn't have both Hiroshima and Nagasaki had military manufacturing bases in those towns. They were making weapons. So that was part of the targeting. You're not only knocking out weapons, you're knocking out people who make weapons. That's stopping the war. Kyoto either had no weapons or it had personal attachment for Stimson. It might have been someone he met there. It might have been a family. It might have been a museum. It could have been one piece of art that he didn't want touched.
Maybe his wife said, I like the cherry blossoms there or something. Don't do it.
But no, that is an interesting twist of history that I never heard before. I always heard just those two cities, and I didn't know. I thought it was probably military strategy, but I didn't know for sure. But Kyoto got saved. They should have statues of Stimson in Kyoto.
Interesting. Yeah.
Anyway.
I was going to I meant to open this program with the song from the Annie soundtrack. We'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover.
Wow.
That was my connection to Herbert Hoover growing up. There was this song probably in the first act.
Huh.
Yeah.
That was the name of the song? Was that
That's the name of the song. We'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover, and I was going to play it, but.
Was it sarcastic? They were thanking him for giving us FDR? Was that what that was?
No, they were just, for, the shanty towns. I think if I recall, the song is done in, sarcastic,
Okay, good. Okay.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for, having us eat out of garbage cans.
Right.
Tom, I'm wondering how you're feeling. And if you wanted to jump in with the question, you are unmuted.
Well, I was just wondering, first about Kyoto, whether there was any cultural significance there, whether they felt that there was a great deal of cultural significance or something there that they felt we shouldn't decimate it because if we believe then eventually we're going to be able to rebuild Japan and have a functioning Japan, we don't want to take this away from them. We'll hit a military site. I don't know about Kyoto myself. I was wondering if you knew if there was anything that might have turned their hand in terms of that there's something culturally that they would want to destroy there.
I don't know at all, but it's just very clear that it's something that was very important and personal to Stimson. That seems to be clear, but what it was, we don't know. It could have been, maybe he had a mistress there or something like that, or who knows? I mean, there's just no telling why that was so important to him. But he was, reading about him, I'd like to think that it had a higher purpose and it wasn't random, that there was some sort of, better purpose in that whole thought process. But again, he was convinced that the nuclear bomb was it. That was the end of war. It's going to be peace, love, and happiness forever and ever, because you can't go beyond the nuclear bomb when it comes to destruction. So he, like Einstein, he was convinced that this was worth pursuing because it's going to be the end game, not in a bad way, but in a good way, because people are going to be smart enough not to, do the bad kind of end game. Again, it's interesting thinking. I never heard any of these thoughts attributed to U.S. officials. I've heard Einstein's opinions and other scientists, but I don't remember hearing any government officials saying it that way. Also, what's that?
I mean, Hoover is the great humanitarian, and no child shall be left unfed, unless, of course, they're Americans. In that case,
right.
He seemed to be very, very big, both post World War I and post World War II, in terms of trying to help the children and the people who are suffering in Europe, and I laud him for those decisions. But when it came to helping Americans, he didn't seem to be able to make that jump. And one thing, as you pointed out, the government wasn't really, it hadn't wet its feet in terms of being able to do something like that prior to FDR. But during the years of FDR, he constantly spoke out against the New Deal, even when it had become clear that it was making a positive influence in the lives of people and giving hope to people. He still was against all those programs. So he was observing them functioning and working, but he still was he was an adamant foe of all those.
Yes, and he championed the Supreme Court knocking some down. He was applauding their decisions that they were unconstitutional because he agreed that they were unconstitutional, which they may or may not have been. I don't know those things, but he got more conservative as he got older, for sure. He got entrenched in conservatism to the point where he backed Taft in 1952. And didn't like Eisenhower. Eisenhower was too liberal for him, for continuing too many New Deal programs. And yet he worked with Eisenhower. One of his last things was the Hoover Commission on efficiency, on White House and the executive branch efficiency. And he proved to be very good at that. That was his wheelhouse. He helped create a more efficient White House. At the same time, got deeper entrenched into conservative mantras. I do want to mention one more thing about Hoover, though. He wrote several books, a couple before presidency. I know he co-wrote one. Actually, he co-translated a book with his wife that was written by Mr. Lindgren, one of the early, someone before Lindgren. It was an early metallurgist. They translated a Latin text into English. But one of his last books, might have been his last book, was a book I'd love to find and read. It's called On Growing Up. And it's a book of letters kids sent to Hoover when he was president and his responses to them. And I read some excerpts and I love it. It's really, really, really cool. And I'm going to paraphrase one here. A kid writes him about the presidential traveling system, is president supposed to stay put in Washington, or can he go around and visit? Is that okay? And so he writes back, well, in the days of George Washington, of course, they had to go by horse. And then, we invented the train and then things got faster. And now presidents fly. But unfortunately, planes fly over people's heads like their speeches sometimes do. That's pretty good. I like it. I'd like to read the rest of it because he did have a way with kids, and it's something that was completely not highlighted. In fact, his grandkids were regulars at the White House. One of his sons had 3 kids, all born around the time of his presidency, and they were regulars at the White House. He would walk them around the White House grounds. He would give them candy. He was a great grandpa. At the same time, no photos were allowed. There's a couple that exist that were officially family portrait, but not press photographs. So in the press, Hoover didn't even seem like a family man. He had 2 older sons that they knew about, but they weren't part of the White House scene. And the rest of the family wasn't discussed because that's the way Herbert wanted it. His family was off limits, including his siblings, including anything about his family. So he could have used his humanitarianness with his grandkids to show that he was a grandpa too. And no, that was not going to mix. Those two things were not going to mix.
He did show his dog though.
He did show his dog. Bad timing on that though. Really bad timing. These porterhouse steaks to the dog in the Depression, not a good campaign technique now.
He had a remarkable capacity for self-delusion as well. I mean, the way that Depression built up, and when it was 8% unemployment, he said, we're going to get out of it. When it was 12%, it's a flash in the pan. When it was 15% unemployment, prosperity is right around the corner. When it was 18%, 20%, even when he was going into re-election, it's, we're right there. We're right at the cusp. It's incredible. I mean, how bad did the thing have to get before he could acknowledge we got a serious problem on our hands?
And he kept putting his foot in his mouth too. He didn't stop making those kind of statements. And I know they were trying to reassure the public. But one thing that's really different about this Depression compared to the previous 3 or 4 before that we really don't pay much attention to because they weren't great enough, apparently. The Depressions of 1870, I call them depressions, not recessions, by the way. The Depressions of 1873, 1893, and 1907, those are the 3 big ones before this one. And the difference between the one from 1929 that lasted 12 years, according to most official reports, the difference was that by 1929, we're almost completely a cash-based economy. In 73, in 93, and in 07, we're coming to that point. But in 1873, the doctors, no problem taking eggs for services. 1893, you can do the barters, no problem. There's no issue with like people have something you want. There's no cash in that storyline. By 1929, where's the cash on the barrel? You're getting tossed out of your property, your house, because there's no cash. All of a sudden, cash becomes king, like where we are now. This is the beginning of the cash is king era in 29. That's why people suffered so much more visibly and so much more demonstrably, because safety nets, including like a barter system, didn't exist. Oh, believe me, people bartered during the Depression, but it wasn't encouraged. It was looked down upon even because that's not part of what a growing economy and capitalism want to show. They don't want to focus on survival bartering. They want to show the bling. So again, I see that as a huge difference. And again, the difference comes, this change in types of depression comes at a time at the very tail end of this restrictive presidency that Coolidge certainly promoted and Hoover followed. And going back in the years before, outside of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, you didn't have dynamic presidents busting the doors open about what 1/3 of control of the federal government means for an executive branch. People like Hoover took that 1/3 very seriously. I only have 1/3 of the power, whereas Teddy Roosevelt laughed at that concept. Yeah, whatever, 1/3, 2/3, 100%, whatever I need today is what. That's how he looked at the presidency. And again, you can argue it any way you like constitutionally, but the facts remain. Hoover was constrained by his times, and I think that probably makes him seem even more delusional looking back today at his statements, which certainly made no sense at all. And to me, the ultimate crime in all of this, because it's new to me, I know about a lot of the other stuff, but the Mexican repatriation was like, that was a mind blower to me. Like literally there's public statements where he's blaming Mexican and Mexican Americans for the entire world depression. Somehow a tiny workforce sector in our country is creating a world depression. That's delusional for sure.
I never heard of that either. I mean, that was the first time when I just happened to, this afternoon to take a little peek. And it also was stating how there's always racism and there's always going to be, that segment of the population and such, people who feel that way. But through his statements, it fired up racism and anti-Latino perspectives in California that maintained itself for like decades afterwards. He basically lit a fire and presented the kerosene that continued that fire going on for quite a while there. And the
Yes.
idea that something like almost half of those people were actually American citizens who were repatriated. They say it almost borders on the definition of ethnic cleansing,
Ethnic
what took
cleansing.
place.
Yes, it really does. It touches right on the border. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a forced, but again, the tricky part of the story is the numbers are very fuzzy on who was repatriated against their will, who voluntarily repatriated, and who was like sent out, who was actually banished. The numbers are extremely fuzzy. I've never seen numbers like that fluctuate so much from very, very low to very, very high and everywhere in between. So this is, and it's also, the numbers vary because of this, the years looked at. You'll see from 1929 to 1935, this number. Well, what about from 1931 to 1933? That's a sub number from the middle of those other numbers. So again, depends on the parameters. It depends on who's doing the research. The official numbers are very low. Of course, the official number I think was 80,000 from the the Commerce Department in charge of official immigration numbers, and that was the number of I think it was 31 only, 80,000 repatriated. But again, repatriated doesn't say forced or voluntary. It's the same word, repatriated. It sounds like a force to me. The word to me, I assumed, was you're being forced out. We're repatriating you away. But no, in the same category are people who said, I can't wait to get back to Mexico. Get me the heck out of here. There were many of those people too. They were not all forced, and certainly very few were physically forced, but there are plenty of evidences of that too. There were gunpoint, there were roundups. The worst of it happens in LA, but that's nothing new. We've had bad law enforcement stories from LA for a long, long time now. And in LA, they were doing roadblocks. They were basically setting up right on the edge of the barrios, and they were taking entire blocks away, kind of like they were doing with Japanese Americans 20 or 10 years later. So yeah, I agree that it is ethnic cleansing. I don't think there's any doubt. Especially the ones who were forced out against their will. No question.
And on the bonus march, as terrible as it was, it could have been much worse. MacArthur, who's I consider to be a bit of a scumbag, he wanted to open fire on them. He wanted to go in there with live ammo. He would have had it and these were veterans. These were veterans of the people who had served their nation largely.
He was convinced that it was a communist thing. He was convinced communists ran the whole thing, and there was an element of truth to that, but it was a very small element. And what happened, I think, is that after the vote failed, in other words, in June of 32, the Senate rejects the bonus bill. A lot of the actual veterans left at that point, and they were paid. Congress came up with payments for some of these people. I'm not sure if they all got paid, but there was like going home money. And so many left, and it was assumed they would all leave. But the ones who stayed apparently ended up with a higher percentage of communist agitators who were just looking for trouble. They were not veterans. They had no interest in the bonus. They were simply any groups of disaffected people were attractive to them. And so these are the people that MacArthur said were running the show, which isn't necessarily true, but they were probably more higher concentrated numbers than they were prior to the vote in June. So there might be an element of truth, but to say that it was like a communist plot to overthrow the government or anything like that is absolutely crazy talk. He was a crazy man. Douglas MacArthur, he did the same thing with Truman. Like he didn't listen to orders. He did whatever he wanted to. Whatever that means as a military guy, I don't know, but it sounds like the epitome of insubordination. And he should have been publicly if Hoover had publicly reprimanded Douglas MacArthur, he would, and at the same time legalized beer, it would have been a much closer election in 32. He would not have won, but it would have been closer.
In MacArthur too, during World War II, he was against the dropping of the bomb because he wanted a land invasion of Japan, because he wanted to have the honor of the greatest invasion of all time being something that he had done, even though the numbers on it would have been unbelievable, not just from the perspective of American killed in action, but I mean the numbers of Japanese who would have been killed, and the house-to-house fighting, because the people were basically preparing to die to every man, woman, and child. It would have been just millions of people would have been killed in that, in a door-to-door combat throughout the entire Japanese nation. They didn't even need to really invade the Philippines at the time. They could have just cut it off navally. But he wanted to, his pledge, I will return. He wanted his big photo up, and they just ended up with a bloodbath throughout the Philippines and such. He's really ferociously overrated in terms of what he
ferociously like overinflated ego too. But getting just to one more small story, kind of tying up a little loose end from World War II. This came across in the Stimson research, and it's something that I won't call it a smoking gun, but it's something that I've been looking for, like corroborating evidence on, and it's the first time I've actually seen corroborating evidence on this little detail in a long time. And what I'm referring to is the in the weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor, what I had read years ago is that our Japanese our U.S. soldiers who were doing the Japanese code breaking. They had code breakers assigned to various languages who were, focusing on, getting through the codes. And apparently, in the weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor, our American code breakers had cracked the Japanese code and had learned of an imminent attack on Pearl Harbor and had shared this information with FDR. And I had never seen any other reference to this until reading the diary of Henry L. Stimson, Secretary of War, who was informed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt 10 days before Pearl Harbor about an imminent attack. And his concern wasn't about like where to send the soldiers to safety. It was about how this looks like they fired the first shot so we can get in. And I know this may come as like shocking news to some people out there, and it's partly why I shy away from going into more recent history, because I'm not really here as a historian to rattle the sensibilities and the settled facts or whatever passes for them of people who have been around. And I'm particularly referring to my dad at this point. We don't have, like, I read history, he lived it, but we don't have the same conclusions. And this is a story that some people find very offensive, that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor and let it happen because we needed to get in without argument. And that also comes up in the Stimson diary entry. This ends the argument about isolationism and Hitler and all those other things. And it sure did. It was easy after Pearl Harbor. But this knowledge to me is like, again, it's kind of how the world works. I'm not surprised or upset as I am just kind of like trying to get to the point of what people knew when and what that means. And I just, again, it was one of those moments of, I knew this would show up somewhere else. And here it is with a very credible source. I mean, Stimson's diary is not considered questionable or grandiose or egomaniacal. It's pretty sound as far as, giving you his opinion, but also the inside workings of history. And again, just thought I'd share that.
I remember when I was a kid in high school, and I was a bit more of a conservative bend, actually much more of a conservative bend back then than I am now. But I had written a paper suggesting exactly that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor, and my history professor, who was a New Dealer, gave me a C+, the lowest, the lowest grade I had ever gotten on anything in high school. I was pretty sharp back then until my mind went. But it's funny because I have a tremendous affinity for Roosevelt over the years now, for the Roosevelts, Teddy, Eleanor, and FDR, for what they did for this country and such. And it's something that's really hard to square, the idea that possibly, and we look at the sinking of the Maine with Teddy Roosevelt as the the head of the Navy at that time. We look at or was he vice president? Was he vice president at the time?
He was the assistant secretary of the Navy.
Assistant secretary. When the Maine, which I think was probably sunk by us, not just we covered up an accident. I actually think we probably, they're probably the equivalent of Black Ops back then.
I think the official story is it was an internal explosion, it was certainly not Spain that did it. That we know, but it wasn't sabotage. It probably was just a big accident.
What was it that Pulitzer said at the time? He said only a maniac could think that the Spanish actually blew up the Maine. But he still sold a lot of newspapers claiming it was. And then of course there was the sinking of the Lusitania to get us into World War I.
Yes.
That we knew damn well that ship was filled with munitions, and we were almost like waddling that in front of the Germans' noses to let them say, "Hey, do something about this."
Yes,
so
this reminds me of like the first time I encountered this kind of like, history challenging memories was with Michelle in Manhattan maybe 20 years ago. And I was talking about Winston Churchill and the Lusitania. And he was, I believe, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at that point in England. And he knew all about what was on that ship. And when I said that really upset some people who were Winston Churchill fans, and they got very adamant and very upset, like to the point of like shaking in tears. And like, that's not why I do history. I do not want to rattle people's, sacred memories, even if they're false. That's really not what I'm here to do. I'm here to kind of get to the point if I can. And it's a sensitive subject. I mean, I didn't realize I would be upsetting Winston Churchill fans, when I started going down that road. But again, part of that story is this, and history is always alive. There's no such thing really as dead history, because as long as information comes out to the surface, it's almost like things buried underground that the earth just works up, and all of a sudden this thing is on the surface that's been buried for hundreds of years. And it can't happen that way. And it happens in history too. There's so many examples I can give you of that. And again, opening up diaries years after they've been kind of sealed or locked, ends up giving us new clues and new ideas and new motives. What were the motives? Well, if you know the real story, then you might understand the motives more too. And again, I'm trying to do this more with less of a judgment and just more of like, this is just what happened. Like, I'm really not trying to charge it with like moral ideas of right or wrong. I mean, that's not my place. But again, this is partly why I'm shying away from FDR at this point, because, it's not all rosy and good. And, I don't want people to be upset in that way. And this, I've been told that I'm missing a point. I should just let it blast. Who cares what people think, blah, blah, blah. And I can't do it that way.
So we're going to stop there, Chuck, but that's a really good place to end, talking about history and its role. But we are going to take a break from the president, and we are, like I said, at the top of this program, we're going to go to a program a little different. It's called Why 435. And we're going to talk about that subject on October 23rd at 3 o'clock. There'll be a very detailed description in the sign up for the mill for the fall. And then we're going to go to gerrymandering, something that's talked about all the time on the news these days. We're going to talk about the history of gerrymandering, or as Trish says, Jerry meandering, on November 20th at 3 o'clock. So we'll leave it there. And we thank you once again. Thank you, Tom, and thank you everybody else for commenting and for staying on this long. And it's a lot of interesting stuff to chew on. A lot of things that I think a lot of us didn't know. So
you've got to expand these programs. You have to have them weekly, and you have to have them for 5 hours.
Or I could just give you Chuck's number, and you could just talk.
We could just,
it is entertaining. I have to say that. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Chuck.